All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. I'm T.L. Meyer, a beef systems educator with Nebraska Extension based in Thedford. Today is part of the Center of Ag Profitability's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon Central Time. A full schedule is available at cap.unl.edu. Pasture and native rangeland forage production depends greatly on precipitation, temperature, range health, and soil nutrients. The amount and timing of spring and early summer precipitation plays an important role in annual plant production. Using trigger dates can help livestock producers adjust stocking rates if precipitation and forage production are expected to be below average. Today, we'll talk through trigger dates, discuss how drought impacts forage production, and offer some management options that may be possible for producers at each date. Joining me today are two of my colleagues with Nebraska Extension's beef team. Randy Sainer is an extension educator based in North Platte. Hi, Randy.
Hi, TL.
And Ryan Benjamin is an extension educator working out of Valentine. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, TL.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. As you can see in this photo, this is a picture that was taken during the 2012 drought. This was at the University of Nebraska's West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte. And what we're hoping to cover again today is talking a lot about trigger dates with drought planning. This is based off an article that appeared in the April Beef Watch at beef.unl.edu. And we want to give credit to one of our co-authors, Brad Schick. This is basically the outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to talk about past and the forecasted weather. It's dry, how drought affects plants, talk about reducing stocking rates, how that might look like. And then we'll go through the trigger dates as far as what to look for and possible management options. And then we'll wrap up with some resources that may be helpful to you in your drought planning. I would like to make this disclaimer before we get too far. The options presented today will not work for everyone. They're going to depend largely on what your ranch goals are and what resources you have or don't have. And it's my fervent hope that if we keep talking about it, maybe it will rain. And this won't be an issue this year. As you can see, one thing in the past, this overwinter precipitation is not great for the state of Nebraska and many parts of the United States. This is the percent of normal precipitation from October 1st through the end of March. Then as we move into the March 29th US Drought Monitor, again, you can see Nebraska's dry. And so is most of the Western United States. One thing I would caution with the Drought Monitor, a great resource to check out, not exactly, not right up to date. It's usually about a week behind as far as measuring conditions. So just keep that in mind when using the US Drought Monitor. And this seasonal outlook for drought forecasted for April 1st through June 30th is not good, again, for Nebraska and the Western United States. This forecast was released March 31st. Looks like drought persists according to this map. So one thing, our hopes in doing this webinar today is we'd like to get people thinking, if they haven't already, planning for drought. Planning now is going to provide you more options than reacting later. Make sure you have an inventory of the animals and your feed resources, whether that's actual feed stuffs and or pasture.
So right here, we're looking at a NASA produced product. This is the root zone soil moisture. It's looking at the top 3 feet of the soil. Basically, it shows that in Nebraska, a large part of Nebraska is about 2 to 30% of normal soil moisture. Some of it is up to 70%. The dark blue color that you see in other places across the U.S. is 100% of normal. So Next slide. As drought progresses, soil obviously becomes drier and it holds on to water more tightly. So it becomes an issue for plants to be able to function the way that they need to. So one thing here, if we don't feed cows enough protein, they will metabolize their muscle to make up for that lack of protein. Plants will do a kind of similar thing with water and carbohydrates, particularly carbohydrates, and we'll get into that more here in a minute. So here we can see a picture of a tree. This is the best picture I could find that explains this. Basically, plants operate on a low pressure potential or a negative pressure potential. So due to the fact that the atmosphere is drier, it helps pull water up out of the soil into the roots of the plant, through the roots and out of the leaf. In the bottom of the leaf, there's an opening called a stoma, and this allows carbon dioxide into the plant for use in making sugars, but it also releases water. It evaporates out of there. We call that transpiration. And so plants can close their stoma to limit water loss, but that of course limits the amount of carbon that they can take in to make food for themselves and then ultimately for cattle. So moving on. So back to the root conversation. When plants go dormant due to drought or to winter cold stress, they use carbohydrates that they store in the roots. This is for perennial plants only. Annual plants don't do this. They grow back from seed every year, but perennial plants that come back from rootstock year after year, they store those carbohydrates in their roots, and when they're dormant, they use those carbohydrates to keep the roots and the crown of the plant alive. So this shrinks the root mass as it uses those carbohydrates, and it'll kill some of the roots. So that leaves us fewer roots to take up water later into the drought, as well as sort of recovering from the drought. When we do actually get rain, it takes a while for those plants to build back roots. So when we're overgrazing, that's removing that photosynthetic material above the ground, and the plant has to do the same thing. It has to use carbohydrate reserves to keep growing photosynthetic material that it needs to create food for itself. So if this is compounded by overgrazing and drought, it has long-term health impacts for the plant, largely due to this reduced roots. It is harder to absorb water as well as other nutrients from the soil.
So one thing we talk about in drought planning is usually during a drought, we need to reduce stocking rates. And there's really, that breaks down to looking at two things. You either reduce the grazing time on a pasture or piece of grass, or you reduce the animal units on that piece of grass. So you could reduce the number of animals, or possibly look at a smaller animal unit. And just to be clear, for those who aren't familiar with the animal unit concept, one animal unit is equivalent to a 1,000-pound animal, and one animal unit consumes 26 pounds of dry forage a day, roughly. So as you can see here in this picture, we have a bull and a bred heifer, and they're going to eat different amounts of forage. In the article that we've referenced today, these are the trigger dates listed here that we mentioned in the article. And moving through the rest of the presentation, Ryan is going to discuss what we need to be looking at during those trigger date areas. And then Randy's going to discuss some possible management options that may or may not work for your operation.
So our first trigger date is April 1st. Obviously, we're past that, but it's still kind of that time period, and this is what we need to be looking at. So the first thing is our soil moisture condition. We showed obviously that map that showed that we are drier than normal. The things that contribute to our soil moisture is the previous growing season and dormant season moisture, so precipitation. And we showed this map here at the bottom that shows our dormant season moisture from October 1st to the 31st of March. And once again, that's showing that we are considerably short of precipitation. So this lack of moisture reduces our cool season grass growth. Those are the first grasses that start greening up in the spring, and they're really dependent on this soil moisture to get started.
So when we look at April 1st, some of the management we want to look at, since it's exceptionally dry, we want to reduce our stocking rate 10 to 20% because of the cool season. Grasses are not going to be growing as fast because of the lack of moisture. So this will help with our pasture. The other thing we want to do is inventory all cattle and feed resources. So what can I sell first? Well, probably we're going to sell those open cattle, maybe those late calvers that haven't calved. If you're a February, March person, most of your cows are probably calved. Anything at that April 1 that's left over, you probably want to get rid of. It'll help you with reducing that stocking rate. Anything that you might see that's bulling or that's open, we would want to get rid of them. We might also consider, think about your replacement heifer program. They actually take less animal units than a pair would be, and you would still have calves next spring out of those heifers. You wouldn't be able to sell them anything this fall, but if you got rid of your pairs, that's about 1.2 to 1.4 animal units that they take versus a heifer that's probably 0.8 to 1. So you can save feed by keeping more heifers and maybe selling some of those pairs. The other thing we want to look at is what, your pasture lease. What do you have for a drought cause in your pasture lease? Even if you don't have a drought cause, staying on that pasture could affect it for a long time. So you might want to look at finding more pasture if possible at this time before everybody starts scrambling to find it. And that's pretty much our April 1 management that we would look at.
So April 15th to about May 10th, the things that we can look at, 30 to 45 day forecasts from the National Weather Service at this point are pretty accurate. They can really give us a good picture of kind of the temperature and precipitation that we can expect in the coming months. The other thing that we're looking at is cool season grass green up. By now we're starting to get some growth on our cool seasons, and we can sort of see how they're responding to our current conditions. And that'll give us an idea of what to look forward to throughout the summer. On the next slide, I think we have some maps that these are forecasts for April, May, and June. This shows the temperature outlook. This was issued March 17th. It shows a majority of the US being warmer than normal, Nebraska included. And then it also shows in the next one that a large portion of the US is predicted to be drier than normal, or have better chances of being dry than wet, I guess is the proper way to interpret this graphic. And that's again for April through June.
So as we get to this time period, we need to look at maybe decreasing our stocking rate or looking for more pasture. We're gonna have to call maybe more animals. So start looking at those cows that have calves that don't gain as good, don't weigh as good, those later calves that aren't gonna fit with the rest of them. So you can sell a more uniform bunch of calves at the sale barn. Delay turnout will help the pastures, but do you have the hay or feed inventory to do that? So you need to count up and see how much hay you have left. Maybe even consider buying a little hay if you can get to it, if that'll help your pasture. And given that plant time to grow and put some roots down can really help in the future, especially if we start getting some rain.
So the things that we're going to be looking at kind of May 20th through June 10th. Again, these are kind of just rough guidelines, but I think they're pretty good kind of way to look at things. Our needle grasses, our cool season needle grasses, are going to be finishing up their growth, especially by the end of, or the 10th of June there. Wheat grasses, which are also cool seasons, they're still in a rapid growth window, so they can respond to some moisture if we get moisture during this time period. The other thing we want to be looking at is March through May precipitation and how that compares to average. If we've started picking up some moisture, some precipitation, and we're getting closer to average from where we're at now, that's a good situation. But if it's still say 50 or 75% less than average, we're going to be looking at a pretty dry summer probably.
So some of our management things, again, we may have to reduce stocking rate 30 to 40% or more at this time. So again, call late calvers, opens. You know, if you have fall calving cows, you might consider moving some of them depending on where your priorities are. Shorten the breeding season. So we know if you're early calvers, the bulls are going to have most of those cows bred. You might sell one of the bulls, so you're only having one of them to eat forage. They can do the cleanup for you. That depends, of course, on the calving season. And then again, when you look at what you're going to sell, you know, heifers will eat a lot less grass than a pair would. And so keeping those heifers is still going to give you a calf next year, but it's going to really reduce your forage intake.
So from about June 15th to June 30th, the things that we'll look at, cool season grasses are pretty much going to be done growing at this point, unless they're irrigated. I guess smooth brome pastures out east of me, I'm in the sand hills. They might still be growing some. Also, about 50% of our warm season grass growth will be had by the end of June. As you can see in this graphic here, that kind of shows the rapid growth season for warm season grasses. So we can sort of take an inventory of how much grass is grown by this point, and that'll give us a pretty good idea of how much grass we're going to get for the summer. Rainfall after late June might benefit some warm seasons, but it's going to take some precipitation to be able to do that.
So again, at management, by June 30th, you know, depending on when you're calving, some of you may just be putting bulls out, but if you're an early calver, you know, if you sell your old bulls and replace them next year with younger bulls, that might be an option for you. A bull's going to eat about 2 to 2.5 animal units, depending on his size, compared to, so that 2.5 could be used towards cows. You can preg check early, call those late ones in the opens, and sell, like I said, sell your bulls, shorten that breeding season up. It's going to make more uniform calves. And usually in drought, we do see cattle breed up pretty well. Those are some ways to reduce your stocking rate. And so you might think of some of those. And you know, like if you got some cows that you're going to sell in 2 to 3 years because they're getting older, maybe you sell them a couple of years early, just because you don't have the forage for them with this drought. So
from June 15th to July 15th, precipitation and soil moisture during that time period is really important for warm season grass growth. Most warm season grass growth will kind of be wrapping up by July 15th. At that point, you're not going to see much response to more precipitation. There are some short grass warm seasons, like I think buffalo grass, that would benefit from some precipitation at this point or a little later, but they're going to be less forage producing than our other warm season grasses.
So as it gets dry, maybe you have some yearlings you've been keeping over. If you get rid of them at this time or earlier, reduce your stocking rate. And if it's real bad, you could remove cattle from pasture. But again, if you do that, then you have other issues like having to find feed and actually putting them in confinement, which is going to be costly because of our feed costs this year. So it's something to think about, or transporting them to an area that does have forages. We can shorten that breeding season. Of course, if we're a late calvers, we'll be breeding in that July time, but all those early calvers should be pretty well bred. Call those late calvers open and get rid of some of those bulls is going to reduce some of that forage that you need. You could also early wean at this time. Those calves are going to grow good on a high grain diet, or a grain diet that's higher in quality than if you feed it through the cow. The cow's not as efficient putting it into the milk. It'd be better to feed it to the calf. And by doing that, you're going to get about a half a day extra forage per cow by getting rid of those calves, because they're eating about 4/10 of an animal unit at this time. Creep feeding will help reduce the forage consumption of the calf because you're going to eat creep, but it will not reduce the cow and will not reduce the milk production of that cow, because the research shows that calf is going to go ahead and drink just as much milk even with creep feed. The only thing it will benefit you is the forage consumption by the calf. Next slide.
So from September 1st to September 15th, some things to look at. We did get a question, and I will address it here after we get through these slides. So from September 1st to September 15th, some of the things to look at. We can get cool season grasses having some regrowth if we've gotten adequate moisture. So if we catch some nice fall rains and we have a good cool season component to our pastures, we will see some response to that. Also, we can be looking at temperature and precipitation forecasts headed into the dormant season. This is going to give us a look into how next year might be shaping up. We could get into sort of a negative feedback loop here of lower precipitation, which causes reduced soil moisture, causing less herbage production above ground. That's going to cause less energy capture, low vigor, less root growth, and it ends up in this sort of negative feedback loop where we just end up in an overgrazing situation if we're not careful. So we want to be looking at those forecasts to see what next year might be like.
Ryan, do you want to go ahead and address that question on grazing?
Yeah, so we got a question, are the carbohydrates in dormant grass leaves still used by plants, or is overgrazing mainly based on new green growth forage consumption? That's a good question. To some degree, the energy in those leaves is pretty much unavailable to the plant. I would say that overgrazing is more of a concern on growing green forage. Some of those, we do still want to leave some stubble. It can use a little bit of those energy reserves. but more important is for catching snow or reducing erosion, I think, would be my comment on that. Do you have
Thanks,
any
Ryan.
other thoughts, Randy?
No, thanks, Ryan. I think that's good. I'll talk a little bit about management from the September 1 to September 15th. So basically at this time, maybe start planning for next year. And why I say that is in 2012, when we had that drought, I had producers that used kind of their winter range at this time, and they were out of it early. So they had to plan on dry lotting cows. And then those cows were actually dry lotted in 2013 till about the 1st of July, towards the end of June. So they had to get more feed. So start thinking about what you could do if you're planning on holding your cows. Now we know that that can be pretty costly, but in the case of 2012, the guy was very happy because he's able to keep on to his genetics. And then how will drought affect your production? So it also could, usually drought calves tend to be heavier when they're weaned, because the nutrients are more concentrated as long as they have plenty of forage. And we usually have pretty good breed up on drought, which is kind of unbelievable if that's what usually happens. But we can still be early weaning, because even September 1st is, and we think of early weaning from about 60 days on calves. They've even weaned them as early as 45. But again, you have to have specialized diets to make sure that you're meeting their requirements. And then also possibly marketing those calves earlier than you normally would. They'll still bring pretty good money. You may not get quite as much total per calf if you wait, but if you don't have the feed, it might be a marketing option. Or you might also look at backgrounding them in a feedlot. Make sure you know the cost it's going to cost you to do that. But there will probably be open feedlots because of our reduced number of cattle. Cow numbers are going down, so there's probably going to be more room there. So that's one thing. Also, let's make sure we have our corn stock leases. By then it'd be earlier to do it in August. If you can do it in August, that'd be good too. But corn stalks will give us a chance to use forage that's out there. That's a great resource for us that maybe you've not ever used before, but it'll get you through the winter without having to dry lot those cows. And then you still may have to that spring, but at least it covers a lot of the winter for you. But make sure you can find somebody that understands cows and make sure that they'll take care of them good, or else make sure it's close enough where you can check on your cows. But it'll save you some money. And then also when you're acquiring feed. So in a lot of cases, there is some programs out there where you can get help with buying hay, and we'll talk about that later. But make sure you're not bringing in invasive plants. That happened to my family actually in the last one. They brought some from South Dakota and got some invasive weeds in our pasture that we have to spray now. So watch that. And then the other thing, if you're getting it out of Missouri or some of the fescue belt states, cattle in the sandhills are not used to fescue. And so that could be a real problem with you. You could lose a lot of ears, tails, and even have some adverse effects on your cow herd. So make sure you know what kind of forage you're bringing in.
So what we wanted to talk about today is droughts in the forecast. And if you're not planning for drought, well, welcome to Nebraska, because it's a fact of life. It's going to happen. What we're really hoping by doing this webinar today is that if you haven't already planned, that you start planning now. Again, because planning now is going to give you more options than having to react later. Just a reminder, when we talk about reducing stocking rates, that can either be shortening the time on the grass or reducing the number of animal units on the grass. I think the key thing here, based on the variety of options we've shared, is we encourage you to be flexible in what you do. And by providing these trigger dates, we hope they can be a tool to help you manage your grass and weather the drought and the high costs. These are some resources we used in the paper, and we hope they can be useful to you as well. The National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center offers short and long-term precipitation and temperature forecasts. There's an ebb guide available, skillful grazing management on semi-arid rangelands. The link for that can be found at the Beef Watch article. We'd also encourage you to visit the beef.unl.edu website, as well as the drought.unl.edu website. At the Drought website, you can find a ranch planning guide for drought planning called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch. This is a thorough, very comprehensive document that can help you write your ranch drought plan. And of course, the FSA and the NRCS have drought programs available, or will have some in addition. It's best, we recommend you check with them to get all the details. But one thing with the government programs, make sure you are keeping records.
So TL, Ryan, we have a question. And so will volunteer weeds and eastern red cedar be more likely this year? Ryan, I would say if we get rain towards the end, you'll see more weeds. And of course, be careful about the hay you bring in. Eastern red cedar, I'm not sure about. Ryan, do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, so I would say the big thing would be after we come out of drought, we're probably going to have increased bare ground. And so that definitely gives weeds a spot to get started. Eastern red cedar, I'm not so sure about that. I do think that just like any weed, they'll take the opportunity of increased bare ground to get started at the end of drought. That's more when I would be worried about seeing weeds than during the middle of the drought. And back to the previous question about leaving dormant forage for plants. I think the other thing that a little stubble is really important for is kind of insulating the crown of the plant during the winter. If you graze that off just right down to the nubbins, that plant's really, it could be affected by frost, cold stress. So having some insulation on the top keeps that plant going throughout the winter.
Thank you, Ryan. And one resource we don't have listed here is we would encourage you to reach out to your local extension office. If they don't have someone available that can help you, most likely they know someone who can. With that being said, if you'd like to contact any of the three of us with questions, here's our contact information. We just all happen to office on Highway 83, so that's the easy way to find us. And with that, if you have any questions, we'd encourage you to type them into the chat box.
So we have a question. What are your thoughts on planting annual forages such as sorghum Sudan as a supplemental grazing source in lieu of row crops on marginal crop ground? You want to take a stab at that, Randy?
Yeah. So, Jerry Valesky's done a lot of work on adding annuals. The thing you got to be careful of with annuals especially during a drought, is nitrates. And so you really got to make sure you test them for nitrates before you put any cows out there, because I've known people to kill cows, especially in drought years, just because and then even after you get a little rain, sometimes you'll get nitrate problems. So make sure you check your forages before you graze them. You can hay them, and then you can take a sample and know if you can mix it or not. But boy, putting them out there grazing, it's really a challenge in drought because you might get some nitrate issues. So you want to be careful. If you can put it in at a time when we get more rain, I thought maybe oats would be good this year, but so far, no more rain than we've got. Oats probably isn't a very good one this year. And if we have a dry summer, Sudan sorghum, be careful of nitrates. Pearl millet's another one. Maybe next fall, if we start getting a little rain, you might look at a fall oat crop, or even putting in some rye for next year, for next spring. But it all depends on moisture. If you got some irrigation, that would really help you. And putting in a cover crop behind corn or soybeans or, seed corn's a really good one. That's going to benefit you a lot and give you some more forage. So those kind of things I think can really help you. We have another question here. Is it better to reduce stocking rate at the start of the grazing season or stock at normal rate with the agreement that drought could shorten lease duration? Or does it matter as long as there's communication with the renter prior to cattle going in? What do you think there, Ryan?
So I think it's really important to understand that stocking rate is the number of cattle on a given area over a certain amount of time. So the answer to this question is both of those are an option to decrease your stocking rate. I hate to give that answer, but if you go in with fewer cattle over this normal lease period, you've decreased your stocking rate. Or if you go in with the same number of cattle, but less time, you have decreased your stocking rate. So I think I would say communicate with your renter. Yes, before the cattle go in, because if you can't come to an agreement, you might not want to be renting to them or leasing from them, depending on the situation.
And depending on how you lease the ground, if it's by the month or if it's for just the total acres, may mean it make a difference in who gets the payment for drought. If you're doing it by the month, it's going to go to the person that owns the land because you have the option of taking them off in most cases. That's what NRCS would say, or FSA, I'm sorry. But if you're doing it by the acre, then you're committed for a season usually, and usually then the renter would get that drought money. So make sure you know and talk to your FSA before you do that, because that could make a big difference for a producer.
I would say Michael has a good point in that second question regarding communication with the renter, stressing the words prior to cattle going in.
Yes.
Again, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. Well, seeing as there's no further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu, where you can also register for other upcoming webinars. Please click the link in the chat box here to take a brief survey to provide feedback on this webinar and inform our upcoming sessions. Thank you again for joining us today.
Can we repeat who collects USDA drought money?
It depends on how you've rented your land. So I would say I would talk to the Farm Service Agency to make sure that you know that you have the right lease, because everybody's different, and I don't know if I can actually tell you the exact. But usually, if you rent the land, that would come to you. Versus if you do it by the month. If you do it by the acre, it usually comes to you. But you need to talk to your FSA people to make sure that that's correct. But that's been my understanding in the past.
And thank you, Kristen. That comment is spot on. Do something when the drought is looming. And what that is going to vary from operation to operation.
I think the point of our article on trigger dates is that really gives you an outline and a timeline to think about doing those things. So yep, that's a very apt comment, and hopefully our article in this webinar help people start thinking ahead.
Yes, and we're going to hope that it just starts pouring rain one of these days. So
yes,
so
rain, rain, rain.
We said isn't true. So.
All right, Randy, Ryan, TL, thank you very much. And thanks again to everybody for attending today. We'll go ahead and close the webinar now, but we hope everybody has a good rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.